Welcome. I'm Paul Goldsmith, the chairperson of the Advertising and Marketing section of ITV Japan. My guest today is Bob Pickard, who is the president of North Asia Edelman PR.
That's right.
Welcome. Nice to have you here today, Bob.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you for joining me.
Okay.
Our interview is at a very appropriate time. I'd like to talk to you today, if possible, about communicating in a crisis.
Sure.
Particularly how Japanese handle that, Japanese companies in particular, handle that situation. It seems to me, and I've been here a number of years, that Japanese companies typically don't do a very good job of handling crisis. There's a lot of bowing at press conferences,
yes,
often tears from the president, which is considered then to be a way of apologising and getting acceptance for the mistakes that have been made from the public and maybe investors. What is your feeling as a professional when you see the way Japanese companies behave in a crisis?
I think when we see the bow, we know the crisis has not been successfully handled. Most successful crisis communications consist of crisis preparation, crisis prevention. So when you see that the crisis has not been well handled, that is a sign of failure. There's something called the paradox of transparency that I think is really important here. Our advice to clients is to come out and admit right away if you've done something wrong in a very transparent and open way. And in Japan in particular, the corporate reaction, if senior management becomes aware of something that has gone wrong, it's to cover it up, it's to keep quiet, it's to make sure at all costs it never gets its way into the newspapers. So even though it's counterintuitive and ironic, we say come out, put the facts on the table, take control of the news cycle, and define in a positive way what is the reality of this crisis so you can inspire confidence as a trusted company.
Is that a typical style in the US?
I think very much so. I think the modern crisis communications discipline, this paradox of transparency that I mentioned, it's a little more widespread there. But let's face it, as long as there's corporate malfeasance, scandal, mistakes are made, then this is going to be a constant challenge that companies have to master, regardless of geography.
There have been a number of scandals recently, maybe if I'm specific, like looking at Mitsubishi Fuso,
Sure.
with the wheel coming off the truck and the way that was handled, the hiding information, and then to my surprise, the person that was killed, the family suing, and actually Mitsubishi Fuso going to court over that rather than settling quietly. If you were advising, for example, Mitsubishi Fuso, what would you have recommended?
Don't cover it up in the first place. Because later on, when the facts come out, and in this era of blogging and of internet ubiquity, the truth always comes out in the end. So don't even try to cover it up. If you've done something wrong, come out and put the cards on the table. Take responsibility for what you've done. It's a lot more costly in the end for a company to have to invest in rebuilding a tarnished image that's destroyed because the story becomes the cover-up. How you tried to conceal information from the public. That's not a very trustworthy response, is it?
Right, not at all. Does Edelman, for example, do you work with executives to prepare them for what could be a crisis? So, for example, if it was someone like a Mitsubishi, years ago, Snowbrand with their milk problem, would you work with those executives to coach them that in the event of a problem, this is how you should handle it?
Absolutely. I mean, most of the training that we do for clients is how to prevent a crisis happening in the first place. But most companies assume it's never going to happen to them or at some far-off day in the future, and they're somehow immune. It's almost like it can't happen to me.
Right.
So we try to debunk that complacent thinking and prepare executives for the day when it does happen, because sooner or later it does happen to all companies. There's a fire. There's a sexual harassment situation. There's layoffs. There's some bad issue that goes from being in the private domain into the public domain in a very negative way. So executives, when a crisis does occur, they're under extreme pressure. Crises are so unpredictable. They need to know what is the professional way forward in such a circumstance. So that's what we focus on.
From your time here in Japan and comparing that to your experience outside of Japan, do you think it's purely a cultural issue, the way that Japanese handle crisis differently, or Japanese corporations handle crisis differently from what we're used to in the West?
I think face reigns supreme, and so sometimes when you have to escalate to a public explanation for something that goes wrong, individual responsibility, company responsibility, that becomes an issue. There is this really unsettling tendency sometimes to blame others or to assign responsibility outside of the company. But if it happened to you, or it's your customer who was affected by the flawed product, then you, the company, must take responsibility, regardless of any concerns about the face issue, because it's far more injurious to the company longer term to lose the brand value and the money basically through lost sales that not handling it right is going to cost you.
I don't know whether Edelman has done this, but have you ever looked back at how Japanese corporations have recovered from a crisis? For example, say Snow Brand, who then rebranded their products as Meg Milk, or I guess even looking at how Mitsubishi Fuso will gain trust again with the public. Have you looked back to see what processes have had to be put in place and how effective they've been?
Actually, we do. Whenever we do crisis consulting for a client, we do an audit. We look at their past crisis situations, how they handled them, what decisions were made, who made the decisions, how fast were these decisions made, how were stakeholders informed. And so it's actually through a review of the history of a company's past conduct that we're able to give them advice on how never to encounter this again, or how to be the master and not the servant of a crisis situation. Because let's face it, in most of these crisis moments of truth for a company, they can either manage the crisis or be managed by the crisis.
Yes.
And I think the key point here is, a company can spend, I don't know, $50,000, 5 million yen, to do a crisis preparation exercise, to do all kinds of simulation, what if type case study training. Or a company, if they don't do that, they can spend millions and millions and millions of dollars trying to rebuild a tarnished reputation, which is far more costly to recover than it was to build in the first place.
Do you find when you sit down with executives and you go through the what-if scenario, do they take a position that, well, this is really unlikely to happen, or do you find at the end of this kind of session people are quite shaken up by the potential problems that could be facing them down the track?
I think in most cases there is an ongoing corporate denial, a feeling that, I've been doing this for 25 years, and if a crisis does occur, well, we'll know what to do. It's almost like an arrogance. And I think when we hear that kind of talk, that's when we know that this company is not ready to deal with it. I think as well because look at Nissan, for example. They sell cars in more than 190 countries.
Yes.
And different cultures have different expectations. And there's different risk factors in different countries. And so it's not simply a question of is the headquarters senior leadership ready, for example. It's a question of does this company, which has to inspire the confidence of stakeholders around the world, have in place in all of those markets across its diverse lines of business a crisis communications regime where not just the top 3 or 4 people buy in to the need for crisis